There is a popular term amongst spiritualists called the dark night of the soul, or DNS, as I will refer to it as, that denotes a soul struggle to release limiting beliefs and behaviors. It is not a choice that one makes, because no one would choose ego dissolution and despair, but rather a push by a divine force to ascend beyond one's lower nature, to face one's shadow, learning to integrate it, and to self actualize and ultimately live in one's highest purpose. Facing oneself, flaws and all, is meant to be a soul cleansing experience and endeavor, purging the ego of a false self or facade, the falling away of which reveals the path for a person to live their highest timeline and as their highest selves. For this reason, the notion of awakening is used synonymously with the concept of ascension, an attainment of a higher level of consciousness. There are many ways for this so-called awakening to occur leading to the denots, but it usually comes about due to a traumatic life circumstance leading to heartache and subsequent soul loss. Lives are not relegated to just one DNTTS unless they are so consistently high vibrational, self-aware, self-actualized, and self-effacing in nature that there are no ego traps to fall into, or that the one dark night was sufficient enough for them to give up entirely and end their own lives, whether in the indulgence of a shadow aspect of self, i.e., addiction, or abruptly by their own hands. Either way, the soul's journey to a higher plane of existence takes immense amounts of courage and fortitude, and is made all the more exhaustive by its unfolding on the physical, material plane as well as the mental, spiritual, and even at times, the astral. I have been blessed to live through more than a few. Either blessed or incredibly unlucky, and lacking in any lasting learning, wisdom, or discernment. My heartache has primarily consisted of devastating breakups, death of loved ones, and soul shattering abuse, betrayal, and deceit at the hands of friends and family. It was in my flailing and failing attempts to contend with overwhelming grief that I was confronted with the darkness of my shadow and the lower aspects of my own soul. The older I became, the more exposure and reliance I have had on codependent relationships of all types and poor coping mechanisms, feeling a sense of self-defeat and diminished self-worth after years of devaluation and discard at the hands of family, friends, and lovers. Although I knew that I held a love for self that defied my negative life experiences and a gratitude for life despite them, it was hard to remind myself of my lovability during times of extreme duress and in the face of recurring traumatic patterns and karmic occurrences. This current dark night of the soul has been the absolute darkest I ever experienced. It is a bleak, eclipsing blackness that has since left scars on every plane of my existence. I suppose that, like all tumbles down the proverbial rabbit hole, it began innocently and well intentioned. My son and I were rapidly building community and growing in our healing through community connection. In fact, people who I had not spoken to for years would resurface and send their regards or want to catch up. It seemed that the curse of isolation and distrust that spread along with the COVID-19 pandemic had broken at last, and my son and I were embracing our roles as crusaders of healing in the community and eagerly engaging ourselves in as many local events as possible and volunteering where and when we could. I felt as if God was walking with us and supporting our journey and purpose to build intentional community. At one point, while I was volunteering in the community with my son, as I had done many times before, I met a man that must have been the age my father would have been if he were still alive. He approached me respectfully and struck up a conversation. He was well spoken and professed to be God fearing with constant references to the Bible and biblical teachings. This struck a chord with me as my father came from a long line of ministers and was a minister himself in his later years. The man asked what my plans for the future were, now that I was ingratiating myself into a new community, city, state, and part of the country. I told him of my graduate schooling and plans to become a therapist. He insisted that I start a business and that he would mentor me to financial success and sovereignty. He knew that growing a successful business was hard and slow, and so he hired me to do some work for him, having me sign a work contract and non-disclosure agreement. I did not think much of it as I had signed many a contract and NDA in the past. It seemed routine and was explained to me as being a formality. I thought that if the onus was on me to succeed and I was committed, What could go wrong? Perhaps I should have asked more questions, but I had enough plates to spin as a single mom with pets and in graduate school, and his relentless check in, calls, and encouragement put me at ease to some degree. I decided to trust this man's seeming obvious dedication to my well being. It was not long until he had asked me for money to do the paperwork to start my business. A few $1,000s later, not only did I not have a properly registered business, but he had also accrued debt in my name and sold other of my private information, biological information as well, I would soon find. I felt unsteady and deeply depressed. This man was no Christian, and I was drawn in by the forked tongue of a serpent disguised as my deceased father. I was forced to nurture a business that I had not wanted to start, and which had immediately been defrauded, and not just once by him, but thrice. I recovered slowly, but was devastated having just left a narcissistic relationship, only to be drawn into another contract with a narcissist. My vulnerability and the consequences of my gullibility felt relentless and debilitating. I took it as vital learning in the matters of business and was determined to move forward and recover financially and emotionally. I felt small and defenseless, but was determined to shake it off and move forward, having found at least friends that I could lean on or draw inspiration from. Or so I thought. Little did I know I was not exiting the rabbit hole, only being drawn further down it by everyone that I knew and trusted. The next deception is one that has devastated every fabric of my being. Such is the ripple effect it has had on my life and all involved. I mentioned in a previous post that I met a man in the city that my son and I recently moved to, and we both saw in him the potential to become a necessary and much missed part of our family. In a moment of reckless revelation, I invited him to our home and implored him to make it his own by asking if he wanted to father a child of his own through my very vessel. Verbatim, my message read, "Do you want to come over and make a baby?" I do not know what I thought would be in it for him. Ideally, he would feel the same for me and be excited to take on all of my alluring responsibilities as well: child, dogs, birds, cat, plants, and if he wanted, the less desirable responsibilities as well. For example, the bills and crippling debt, although there was no expectation or hidden motive in that regard. I assumed that he would also be delightfully endeared by my obvious tinge of mental illness and over romanticization of our short friendship. I hoped that this recipe read to him not just palatable, but indisputably appealing. To that end, I don't even know why him, a virtual stranger, nor why I thought to proposition him in this aggressive manner, only to say that to me, he was not a stranger. I do not mean that we were acquainted well enough to be more familiar than foreign. It was that to me he was never a stranger. From the moment I met him, he had felt known to me, and as I had written in the aforementioned post, that meeting him was as if past, present, and future converged into a singularity. There was instant recognition, as though we had known each other from a past life. There was the obvious present unfolding before us, and there was the future that I was sure, nay, insistent that we would share in this life as well. He appeared in my dreams, and I could hear his voice in my head when we were not together. I felt that I could feel and sense him all around me. It was mind-bogglingly bizarre and mysterious. Many cultures speak of the soul being split into two, divine masculine and divine feminine energies, meant to elevate humanity through high vibrational love. This love inspires others to embrace unconditional love for self and others. These souls often trigger each other's egos, leading to a spiritual awakening, which includes experiencing a dark night of the soul. There are various indications that one has met their divine counterpart, and I was careful to check those boxes before voicing my thoughts. When I told a friend of mine that this man might be my real twin flame, I referenced the idea that my husband was my false twin flame. The false twin is typically toxic and abusive, pushing a person to live in their shadow self. The true twin flame, on the other hand, triggers healing by reminding the person of the false twin, forcing them to confront their wounds. I would soon find that in my case, it was more akin to fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me. I first learned of the twin flame concept after separating from my abusive ex husband. I became obsessed with understanding why he had hurt me so deeply. It wasn't just the physical and emotional abuse that shattered me, It was his calm, deliberate threat to ruin me, which felt excessively cruel. I still cannot comprehend the depth of his hatred and the level of cruelty, depravity, and ritualized abuse that I suffered as a result. I am accepting of a divorce, but a ruin? That seemed unnecessary, especially considering the contention came from his many abuses against me. My research into that type of narcissistic abuse led me down many avenues, both esoteric and academic. I psychoeducated myself on personality disorders and archetypes, which led to Jung and the notion of synchronicities. On the twin flame journey in particular, synchronicities are said to be an indication that one is not only on the ascension path, but that they may soon meet their true twin, or for some, come back into union with their twin if the triggering was so distressing that it led to relationship strain and eventual separation. I was not deluded enough to think that I had ever been in an actual relationship with this man, but I intended to. Possible girlfriend be damned. Regardless, having met him triggered yet another dark night of the soul. I had all these fantasies created for us, but had not truly contended with our differences in any significant way. We had radically different lifestyles and innate beingness. All of this would have been just fine, if not for the fact that these differences boiled down to my inability to fully grow out of past trauma, the result of which led to my struggle to handle some very basic adult responsibilities. Responsibilities that I was straining to maintain after the abuse of my ex husband, let alone improve upon. I was keeping up with bills despite receiving no child support from my abusive ex, but was not getting ahead enough to clear any debt. I was not an addict by any means, but I occasionally enjoyed a variety of altered states. I was a kind and generous person and a good enough mother, although I was prone to impatience and could never seem to curb my penchant for cursing. I was battling ADHD, but had a routine that worked for me and a confidence to support flexibility and resiliency. This guy was my opposite in nearly every way, it seemed, in terms of responsibilities. As much as he was exactly like me in my fantasies, in the ways that mattered most to me, fun and frivolity. In his mid-30s, he owned his own home, his own business, and was soon to retire. I was already in my 40s and would need several lifetimes to clear all my debt and acquire enough to retire, I felt. I had no clue how to invest, and in fact, my overall financial literacy and even math skills were just generally poor. I certainly was not stupid, but I had a specific set of skills on which I relied. Taking inventory of my life, I began to examine all the ways in which my ex husband's abuse had caused me to lose sight of what it takes to thrive, not merely survive. But I had been getting better. I was in graduate school to be a therapist and help others who had overcome abuse, as well as doing extra work within the institution to help support other Black folks, whether as therapists or in the wider community. I was leveling up, but it was slow, arduous, and I was admittedly becoming complacent with my level of momentary mild security and mediocrity. I felt that if I could fully heal the heartbreak from my ex husband and learn to forgive him and myself, I could stop believing that I was broken and unworthy of love from self and others. Love in action, not just in theory. My trip to Southeast Asia was a necessary first step in this healing process. I returned to the very place I met my ex husband years ago, and my son and I scattered my dad's ashes in that very spot, metaphorically burying both men, the dying of one which caused the meeting of the other. I was ready to return healed and whole and focused on growing into the person I was always meant to be. A person deserving of healthy relationships with healthy individuals and a loving partnership with a responsible, loving man. We returned home, but it was a vastly different place than when we had left. I do not know if it was because we had changed, or if it was because it had changed. First, I did not see that guy again, my son's future father, and the father of any of my future children. In fact, everyone we knew prior to that trip seemed to disappear. What was once familiar was now decidedly unfamiliar and estranged from us. I knew that I was still in the midst of an awakening as I was experiencing wild synchronicities and signs of divine meaning and origin. I believed at one point that I was having some form of psychosis replete with hallucinations, auditory, visual, and otherwise. I began to see myself and my ascension work everywhere, synchronistic. Every confrontation with an aspect of self that needed work or rework reminded me that that man was possibly still out there somewhere, waiting for my work to be finished so that we could race through the airport to our gate and run away together. I began to focus on myself and my work. I started a business. I got in shape, running double-digit mileage on a regular basis. I started to purge my life of things that I no longer used or things that I had outgrown or that belonged to outdated versions of myself. The synchronicities were not necessarily magical in a positive sense. I was confronted with distorted projections of self and shadow that were not entirely accurate. Allusions to and accusations of me being a narcissist and horrible mother, with reference to me being the anti-hero, sung about in the Taylor Swift song, the murderous mother from Flowers in the Attic, and the god Saturn, who famously ate his children. It was so confusing to be victimized and then blamed or gaslighted into thinking that I was the problem, not the covert attacking of an innocent woman and child. Only strangers approached us, and only then to act odd in our presence. They would allude to knowing intimate information about me or my son and our past, accosting us with those same distorted projections, outright lies, and or controversial and uncomfortable conversation. They would question me about things that were only posted to private boards on my social media, typed in emails, texted to friends, or whispered to lovers under the covers and under the cover of night. Some were secrets about me that only knew. The characters that approached us even made reference to things that I had consumed that day, food, alcohol, or other substances, or things that I thought in my most human moments. I was told that I had an eating disorder, or was some form of meth addict because of the mildly stimulant nature of my narcolepsy medication. What was the point of this gaslighting? To try to convince me that I was the problem and in need of conforming? What community standard could be objectively upheld in a city of crime, corruption, mass mental illness, and homelessness? All things that I had moved to the city to help ameliorate. It felt backward and also not effective in that their projections of me did not stick to me as truth, only as attack and unwarranted, erroneous and unnecessary. Any positive synchronistic opportunities or manifestations were either missed or muted due to the ongoing horrors and atrocities. Those are hard to see and act upon when transmuting pain and trauma. It was a vicious onslaught, and I would have likened it to a bad psychedelic trip. Only I have never had bad trips or trance states of any kind. My shadow self had always been kind and nurturing to me, easily integrated and without inference to, or reliance on a superego cultural ideal, conditioning, or engineering. I had always been a sovereign being, and my inner wisdom had always gently guided me to a higher plane of being that was beneficial for all. This was nothing like that. It was aggressive, confusing, and abusive, terrorizing even. It wired me for self-protection and distrust of others. I could not figure out what was going on, but all signs pointed to my recent deceptions, the loss of my private data and biological information, and even my twin experience with people's constant referencing unrequited love and corroborated by the fact that I had not seen him since the trip. In fact, in a few moments of frustration, I texted him and even drove by his house once. Only he was not home and only responded to tell me that I was acting crazy and that I should never contact him again. He even referred me to a mental health clinic in town. I was baffled. I felt I had entered some upside down world. The parallel between this situation and aspects of my past did not escape me. The God fearing fatherly figure whose duplicitous character I needed to grieve, leading me to yet another karmic male romantic ideation that became ugly, covertly abusive, and surreal that I would need to heal from as well filled me with self-loathing, self-pity, and even deep feelings of victimization, a mental state that I stayed in for far too long. It all seemed so contrived, cruel, cartoonish, psychopathic even. It was as if I went through the looking glass and met characters from Tim Burton, Franz Kafka, and Jim Henson. I turned inward to find answers as to why, but after many months battling a deep depression and asking myself what I could have possibly done wrong and why there were so many people involved, I turned instead to spirituality, finding no answers within my rational or logical mind. I got reacquainted with the God of my father, only to find the notion of turning the other cheek unhelpful, to being someone with a history of abuse. When am I allowed to fight back? It made me feel confused and disempowered. Perhaps I would have offered my unmarred cheek, but there was no opportunity. Being ostracized and in isolation, I began to learn and watch tarot, only to hear my story on the lips of every reader, making me even more obsessive about news as to what was going on with him and other people I once knew in the town that had ghosted me since our trip abroad. New one appeared for me to turn a cheek to, or to discuss what was happening. It was not just uncomfortable, but unconscionable. I was inconsolable. I was a single mother with no social life other than caring for my son and pets. How could I have possibly become public enemy number one? It did not stop there. Things got darker. The once sweet voice of the man I wanted to manifest turned more sinister. It was suggesting darker things. I began having intrusive thoughts telling me to kill myself or that were sexualizing and admiring of other women that I passed. I consider myself on the LBGTQS spectrum, much like I consider us all to be, only I've never felt compelled or even attracted to another woman in a sexual way, and certainly not to the degree that made me blush and feel shame, as if I were battling unwanted and unconventional or taboo urges. It was not myself, nor my shadow I felt that I was battling, necessarily it felt implanted in my mind. Considering my shame and embarrassment, I felt as if I was eavesdropping on someone else's thoughts, not the other way around. I began having dreams that had no basis in any reality I had ever been a part of, and had a quality that was not usual to my subconscious. In fact, the look and feel of the dreams were far too crisp and clear. The faces and places, like those of the imposed thoughts, felt implanted as well. I would wake up groggy and depleted of energy. There were days in which I could barely move or get out of bed. My brain felt as if it was being drained, and sometimes as if it was being gnawed on by rodents, put in a vice grip, or as if I were hit with an intense case of vertigo, even while sitting or laying down. It was enough to go to the hospital for an MRI, thinking that I might have a brain tumor. My son was also having experiences that he did not enjoy. He said that he had mind monsters that would sometimes tell him to misbehave. He would sometimes engage me in conversations using very adult and astute observations and verbosity. He would tell me that there were creepy men inside his head telling him to touch himself. I was scared for him, and of him at time, to be honest, given that his behavior was often erratic. He attacked me one evening and hurt himself, an act that resulted in me being reported to Child Protective Services by his school. We both were having bodily experiences that we could not explain nor fully describe. Our bodies seemed to move in directions without our conscious thinking nor dictation feeling, inhabited by foreign spirits. Our house was broken into many times with me needing to change my locks twice before giving up entirely. My tires got slashed and my bike got stolen along with my son's. It was as if we were lepers. People that we had once spoken to or seen regularly had now completely disappeared. It made me sick, mentally, physically, emotionally. For the life of me, I could not understand why and why us. The shock of it all was that the masses were privy not just to my private information, but also my struggle, suffering, and pain. What were the moral implications to what was happening here? Who decided that we were Frankenstein's monster? Who was the doctor and why were they not on trial? I dug into a bit of research. It took me a while to catch on to the fact that these synchronicities paralleled posts on my social media, namely my Pinterest and Facebook, which were the only ones I used with any regularity. I finally had something to go on. I found answers that fascinated and frightened me. Posts about or with friends clicked and made me realize why certain people had reached out to me after so long. Things pinned on the Pinterest platform were my main persecution. My board labeled everything as a conspiracy had come alive. I had been trafficked, it would seem, and into the metaverse, no less. The realization that my virtual self was eclipsing my real self brought about a complete collapse of cognition into dissonance. Dissonance that was largely attributed to my incredulity and unwillingness to face the reality of what had been going on, and the depths of both depravity and duplicity, not just superficially, but going deep into the shadows of conspiracy. The voices in mine and my son's head, the brain eating suspected pineal gland harvesting, brain draining, constant vertigo, dream attacks, and even my twin flame experience could all be attributed to CIA operations based on ritualistic abuse and torture. The ideal victims whose demographic we fit perfectly: low income and marginalized minorities, isolated and new to the community with little support system, and worse, people who had previous experience with repeated and ritualistic abuse and torture, all of which I was recovering from. We were not people, we were a project. We were not individuals, we were an experiment. Our information was sold the highest bidder, and we were being tortured and tormented by demons, vengeful gods, and the government as part of a game. We were unwitting players in some RPG game, utilizing people as pawns and sim characters. This charlatan Christian, whose work contract I had signed to do administrative duties, now owned our information and biological data and was selling it to people to use us as they wanted, including using our physical vessels as puppets. Not just that, but I began to suspect that there were other victims of this man in town, and for fact, people knew what had happened and was happening to us and did not come to our aid. At one point, our lives were threatened by others in the community that were affiliated with this man. These were prominent community members. I did not doubt that what I knew was dangerous, but never did I think that it was murderous knowledge, unless I started to follow the paper trail around and out of town. On offline. What was the end goal? New World Order. I realized that decentralizing the government and currency was dependent on the checks and balances of its prominent and most influential community members on the local level. And if those individuals are tied to human trafficking, and I suspect other forms of corruption, then the project fails and the local governing systems have simply become a microcosm of larger systems that have failed us all endlessly. This was conspiracy theory turned conspiracy fact, and it was happening to me, to my son, all around me. Globally, why did I have to know this information? Worse still, why did I feel absolutely compelled, nay, obliged to blow the whistle? Who would believe me? At one point in my marriage, my ex-husband declared that no one would believe me about his abuse and violence because of the history of mental illness in my family. That was domestic violence. These were deep state secrets and government conspiracies. This was not my life. It was a poorly cast made-for-TV movie drama. I had no fighting chance of being believed, nor, for that matter, any long-term survival. But I had to say something. There were children whose innocence were being corrupted by this game, and the very real players that were asking them to do inappropriate, perverse, or otherwise criminal things from behind their computer screens, in the comfort of their homes or mothers' basements. The news was full of gang activity, mass shootings, and even suicide cults of children. Children, dark web activity, online gambling, memory spells. It was all too much. I did not feel that I could fight the systems in any effective way. I reported the matter to local and federal authorities, to no avail. I told community members who, in turn, turned away from us. I felt insignificant and afraid. So why then was I still preoccupied with the deceitful relationships that defrauded me, failed me, and that ultimately led me and my son to the slaughter? My obsession was amplified by whatever government-sanctioned psyop seemed to be running in the background. I learned that it was not just for me either. It seemed as though many were experiencing the same or similar events and being attacked in a similar manner. Gang stalking, targeted energy weapons, virtual cyberbullying, and trolling, all of which we were experiencing. These attacks were so encompassing and multidimensional that it stood to reason that it was of a metaphysical nature. In my darkest hour, my confusion turned to fear, and that fear into anger and then rage. Why had God forsaken me in my time of need? The innocent, relatively speaking, loving and trusting person that I had always been was being murdered by this experience and buried by the hardened, embittered person that I felt that I needed to be in order to combat further disillusionment and abuse. The gnashing teeth and claws were far from what I was in my true nature, which was loving and nurturing, relatively speaking. I felt that my very spirit was compromised and dying. At this point, I reached beyond tarot readings and toxic positivity based spiritual guidance and self help feel do goodery. I started to look at other aspects of my shadow virtual and other ways it is accessed and exhibited. This journey led me deeper than divination, but to ancient mysteries, astrology, and discovering elements of self hidden in my birth chart. I found that Jung's archetypes were largely based on astrology and its resulting mythology. I figure if Jung's synchronicities had gotten me into this dark abyss, his archetypes and other insights might see me through to the light on the other side of this dark night of the soul, as I awaited any news from government officials on the matter. How could I have been so gullible and trusting? If my birth chart is any indication, at least, I should be well balanced in my masculine and feminine energies. My sun in Taurus and moon in Aries highlight the beautiful duality within me, Venus and Mars, the Emperor and Empress, both strength and softness, harmonizing as one. I knew I was grounded yet fiercely independent, nurturing but also driven. These aspects have always supported me as I move through life's challenges. Something about this situation was debilitating and draining my strength and hardening my soft parts, the parts that are truly necessary to fully integrate my shadow. I ignored the overarching narrative running for the many and focused on my work. The answer for me in my case, at least, lay not just in my suffering, but in my willingness to endure the suffering as my due. Venus was in Pisces at the time of my birth, and though I do not take much stock in it as any point of boasting, it is said that Christ Jesus had the same Venus in Pisces placement. It is here that my having been a chosen sacrifice made some sense. With Venus in Pisces, I am beginning to understand that my desire for love and to love goes far beyond the physical or superficial. This, I suspect, is what gives me great capacity for love and for connecting the dots and solving puzzles. What better investigator than someone who works incessantly, relentlessly, or even religiously to find the redeeming quality in everyone and everything, even at the expense of self? It is the shadow side to the Venus and Pisces relationship that explains my current struggle and suffering in these psyop-ed karmic cycles. I've often found myself idealizing people, seeing them through a lens of what they could be, rather than who they are. I create these romanticized visions in my mind, believing that love will always rise above the flaws, the pain, the human messiness in all systems, family, community, and government. I believed that love, being the highest truth there is, win, and that that truth would prevail. I thought that villains are often misunderstood heroes and simply lack the opportunity to change for the better. I felt that in my situation, there were no heroes, only different degrees of villainy, as everyone I knew in town seemed to be involved in some way, shape, or other. Despite experiencing the depth of deceit on every level, I still maintained to some degree that the good guys would win and that we wouldn't be killed, or if I was killed, assuming my son would be saved, that my sacrifice turned martyrdom, by way of even this writing, would help to free others. Perhaps I had taken up the mantle and crown of Christ in this truth that I tell, but I have been sacrificed for the glory of others all my life, and in this situation had been silenced for far too long. The shame of cowardice and the disempowerment and degradation of my soul, as a result of staying quiet and pretending not to know, has kept me low vibrational and stuck in a physical, mental, and emotional prison. I suppose this is where my Mars in Libra comes in, with its desire for harmony and balance. I've had to learn that not every battle is worth avoiding, and that keeping the peace and staying quiet at the expense of my own well being is never the answer. I've learned to stand up for myself, to stop compromising who I am, and what I have been through for the sake of an imagined ideal, and to listen to intuition, not institution. I have also learned to tell my story. There is healing power in storytelling, not just for me, but for all. My work may be done by one, but benefits the all, as does everyone's work if done with true intentions and purity of heart. It is an act of penitence that restores the soul and strengthens the spirit. Through this dark night, I am navigating to a destination unknown by my guiding star, my sun. Like the sun, he represents my hope for renewal and a brighter future. He's the constant in my life, and because of him, I know that I can rise, shine, and continue moving forward, even when doubt clouds my path and when the moon casts its many illusions. He's my source of strength and purpose. For him, just as much as for me, I need to heal so I can model healthy and productive consistency of behavior, bravery, and leadership. There is no honor in watching others suffering, reinforced by the mantra, as long as it is not happening to me, as did many individuals in our town. I'm learning to let go of the chimeras I've carried, whether they're about love, success, or my own journey. I don't need to fit into anyone else's mold or be culturally conditioned, I would have thought, although this entire experience has been completely and utterly sobering. What matters most is that I stay true to myself, knowing I'm worthy of love and acceptance, just as I am, mastering my shadow so that I can deflect the projections from the shadow of others, even if the others are many others. The masses. The masses that were refusing to do what was right in this situation and were complicit in our abuse, and have always been. History be told. If what Marx said was true, with religion being the opiate of the masses, then this transhuman technocracy, or rather, techno-crazy nightmare that we have entered into, will be our undoing, and we are all now slaves to a vengeful God in of the machine. I still do not understand, and certainly do not condone the pattern of ritual abuse that is happening on a mass scale. A forced facing of self for the sake of ascension is not something I believe that anyone is sanctioned to implement and execute. Nor do I think it is necessarily effective for any reason other than social engineering and curbing of individuality and autonomy for the sake of the hive. The whole, not to be confused with the all. My dark night would most probably have been embraced with some alacrity, had I consented to being in this ascension game, and had I been more prepared with the rules of engagement for this spiritual war that was waged against me. As it were, it snuck up on me like a thief in the night, robbing me of my innocence, privacy, and dignity. Now, I don't know how effective it was for God or government to dangle dudes like carrots before me in order to catalyze a spiritual awakening. But what is done, and I assume responsibility for my ignorance. Although I will never assume responsibility for the abuse and deep complex resulting trauma. Enough time has passed that I believe that no one will assume responsibility, least of all the government, if this indeed goes as deep as I suspect. The loss of autonomy and invasion of privacy is a gross violation, and yet something I suppose I must contend with living in the surveillance state that is the United States of America. I can only hope that in sharing my personal experience, others might gain some strength and clarity on their own darkness and will seek the path of self exploration and self knowledge, as I have, in order to step out of the shadows and into the light of a true self and higher consciousness. I have since moved out of that town, at least for the moment, although I still feel as I have unfinished business there somehow. For the moment, it has been too much for us to bear, having found no restitution or help from any government officials or any real acknowledgement of our struggles and the ongoing corruption by community members involved or in observation. First rule of Fight Club, I suppose. I am still baffled as to how we ended up where we are in the world as humans. I feel as if 1 in 3 individuals that I know are either avid players of one of these RPG games or in tech, having gotten their degree online during COVID lockdowns from the University of Phoenix, or worse yet, from another mildly psychopathic friend who has them convinced of the pecuniary potential to treat the world as a live action game, a la Grand Theft Auto, complete with drag racing, prostitution, and all manner of brutality, if the Sim City we had lived in was any vindication. All of this entertainment at the expense of others and resulting in real world consequences just serves to desensitize individuals from each other and the collective struggle, suffering, and pain that is the human condition. It all seems to be an extension of the COVID curse, causing division and war among neighbors, family, and friends. A digital disease. Even now, there are occurrences that let me know that I am still being trafficked and that the game is still afoot, which means that someone out there is making money on our data and our very existence. I am determined not to be afraid, but to recommit to a higher power and lean on God to fight my battles for me. Besides, I was and am still ascending on my own. I am rising out of the ashes of abuse and self denial, delusion and disillusionment, and helping others along the way, as was my path and purpose all along. I am not wanting to harden my heart and live in distrust, but am learning to hold my pearls close and to vet people vigorously. I am still someone strong, resilient, and guided by love. It may take time, But I know that piece by piece, I'll rebuild as I have done many times before without man, myth, or masses, twin, government institution, or otherwise. Equipped with this new knowledge of self as learned through esoteric astrology, archetypes, and the Christ, cross, I have had to bear during this time of persecution, I have all the weapons I need to combat the shadow of self or others that threatens to usurp my hard earned balance and rule with a vicious, unrelenting grip on my sanity. I do not know what more I need to do about the matter of the trafficking of an innocent mother and child, as the authorities have done absolutely nothing in this regard. I am still feeling fragile and frustrated, but I am very much healing, and know that through God's grace and mercy, I will heal and one day shine ever brighter, loving both boundlessly and with boundaries.